All right, welcome in, learner. You ready to do this?
Absolutely. Let's dive in.
So you've given us a ton of material about the 2024 election, and, well, it's a lot to unpack.
It is quite a story.
Yeah, we're going to be focusing specifically on Biden's performance, leading up to the election and, well, what happened with the Democratic Party after, especially with, Vice President Harris.
Right.
We've got excerpts from Fight, inside the wildest battle for the White House. So, we should get some really good behind-the-scenes looks at the strategies, the anxieties, all those critical moments that really shape things for both campaigns.
Exactly. Should be illuminating.
Yeah, let's jump right in. So what really struck me is, within Biden's team, it sounds like there was a lot of debate about whether he should even debate Trump.
Yeah. You see that tension early on. Months before the debate, Pelosi and others were already voicing concerns. Real worry about whether Biden could handle that kind of high-pressure situation.
Right, like put him on stage with Trump and who knows what could happen.
Exactly. And Anita Dunn, she was holding on to this, hope maybe, that Trump would skip the Republican primaries like he'd done before, thought that might give Biden cover to do the same.
Interesting. So it wasn't just a given that he was going to debate. There were real strategic discussions going on, weighing the pros and cons.
Absolutely. They had to consider, what if he didn't perform well?
Yeah.
But then there's also the risk of looking weak, like he's avoiding Trump.
Right. Tough call. But what about Biden himself? What was his take on all of this?
Oh, he was adamant about debating. Seemed like his State of the Union address in early March really boosted his confidence.
Okay.
He told Pelosi straight up, I'm going. And then he added, we're setting the terms. Pelosi even writes about how she could sense his eagerness to take Trump on.
Wow. So he was ready for the fight. But, I imagine those anxieties within the Democratic Party, those didn't just magically vanish.
No, not at all. As the debate got closer, Pelosi saw those fears playing out. Lawmakers whispering on the House floor, worried about Trump winning. They felt Biden wasn't looking sharp. And he wasn't out there as much, which just fueled the speculation.
Yeah. Less visibility often leads to more speculation, right?
Exactly. They were worried he was declining, his stamina, mental sharpness, the whole thing. And then, of course, there was the whole issue of Trump's debate style.
Oh, yeah. Known for being, shall we say, aggressive.
To put it mildly, there was definitely a fear that Biden just wouldn't be able to handle that kind of onslaught.
So how did the White House try to, calm those nerves within the party?
A lot of backroom conversations, a lot of reassurance. They emphasized that, debates are part of the process, that Biden would rise to the occasion, that voters would see the clear contrast in temperament, Biden the steady hand versus Trump.
Okay, and then, boom, the night of the debate arrives, and well, it seems like a lot of those fears became reality.
It's pretty striking. Pelosi writes about the moment she saw Biden appear on screen. She says he looked pale, uncertain, and when he walked to the podium, she said he waved to an imaginary audience.
Oh, wow.
That image really stuck with her, this sense of him being unsure, not quite there.
And it wasn't just Pelosi, right? There was a watch party in Atlanta where people had a similar reaction.
Yeah, pretty much. Instant unease, slumped shoulders, people crossing their arms, even gasps. And we're talking about figures like Jamie Harrison, Amy Klobuchar, people who are usually optimistic. Even they looked worried.
So it wasn't just the content of what Biden was saying. It was his overall presentation, his demeanor.
Exactly. And that's what really makes this debate a turning point. Trump did make a factual error about Medicare and Medicaid, but that got overshadowed by the bigger picture.
The bigger picture being?
Biden appearing diminished. The stumbles, slow walk, the pallor, the hoarse voice, it all seemed to validate what Trump had been saying about his decline.
Wow. So, unintentionally, Biden ended up making Trump look like the truth teller, at least on that point.
Exactly. It was a gift to the Trump campaign. Senior advisors were stunned, elated. They'd been worried about Trump's lack of prep. But then Biden walks out and basically hands them the debate.
It's amazing how these things can turn on a dime, isn't it?
Absolutely.
So after the debate, what was the fallout like?
Pelosi's phone was blowing up, flooded with messages from panicked Democrats. One former lawmaker even compared it to Weekend at Bernie's. Like, who's really in charge here?
Oh, man, that's harsh.
It was a common sentiment, this idea that Biden wasn't always all there. One aide who came back to the campaign noticed this discrepancy between how Biden appeared on TV and how he was in person. Like, there were times he'd get out of his limo and just look confused, disoriented.
Jeez. And you mentioned George Clooney earlier. He had some observations too, right?
Yeah. Clooney later said that Biden just wasn't the same as he was back in, 2010 or even 2020. He connected it directly back to that debate performance.
So even for people outside the political bubble, it was noticeable.
For many Democrats, that debate was like the undeniable proof of what they'd been fearing. They hoped it was rock bottom, but, there was that lingering doubt.
And of course, the silence from Biden's inner circle.
Yeah.
That didn't help.
No, it was seen as, maybe complicity or maybe just collective neglect. Like they were either unwilling or unable to address what was becoming increasingly obvious.
Right. And then you add in the fact that Biden's schedule was, well, pretty insane, wasn't it?
It was. All the international travel back and forth to Washington. It was grueling, even for someone much younger. All those time zones, the lack of rest, it had to take a toll.
Yeah, and then there was the whole Hunter Biden situation adding another layer of stress.
Absolutely. The felony convictions, all the, let's say, colorful details of his personal life, that created a whole other set of challenges for Biden and his family, trying to support his son while also navigating the political minefield.
Tough situation all around. Now, switching gears a bit, what about the Trump campaign? What were they doing in the lead up to the debate?
They were already playing the long game, months before the debate even happened, mocking Biden's supposed reluctance to debate. Remember that empty podium they brought out at rallies? Anywhere, anytime, any place.
Oh, yeah. That was a pretty clever visual.
It was. Trying to paint Biden as, afraid to face Trump.
So the Trump team was pretty eager to debate, but was everyone on board with that?
Initially, there were some dissenting voices. Even Anita Dunn, who had worked with Democrats before, was hesitant. But ultimately, the campaign decided an earlier debate was the way to go.
What was the thinking there?
They felt like all the legal stuff surrounding Trump was actually eclipsing his campaign gaffes. The debate was a chance to remind voters why they'd voted him out in 2020.
So they wanted to bring the focus back to Trump's, shall we say, less desirable qualities.
Exactly. And there was this underlying assumption that, Trump being Trump, he couldn't possibly stay on message for a full 90 minutes.
Right. Like he was bound to slip up, say something controversial, give them more ammunition.
Exactly. And they didn't want to wait for the traditional fall debates. They wanted to hit early and hard.
Okay. So let's go back to Biden. How was his debate prep going?
Not great. Reports of mock sessions that were, well, underwhelming. One was even cut short by Jill Biden's friend, Kathy Tomasini, because Biden was just low energy, had a cold.
Oof, that's not a good sign.
Even with a longer rehearsal, aides said it wasn't his worst, but it was far from his best. They knew they were setting a pretty low bar for a sitting president.
And then the reactions after the debate really highlighted the difference in how the two sides saw things.
Oh, absolutely. Trump's surrogates were shocked, but in a good way. They were surprised that there were hardly any Biden allies in the spin room after the debate.
Oh, that's pretty telling.
It suggested chaos, concern in the Democratic camp. Meanwhile, Democrats who weren't as close to Biden, they were furious at his team for seemingly hiding how much he was struggling.
And what about Vice President Harris? What was her take?
She wasn't buying the campaign's initial talking points about Biden having a slow start, stronger finish. It just wasn't credible.
Right. The whole world had just seen what happened.
So she went with a different approach, tried to draw a broader contrast with Trump, shift the focus away from Biden's performance.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
But the Biden campaign still tried to put a positive spin on things, didn't they?
They did. There was this memo going around about Biden's strengths, and again, this slow start but finish strong line. But even loyalists were rolling their eyes. It just didn't match reality.
Right. It felt like they were living in a different world.
Even Mike Donnellan tried to reframe it, acknowledging Biden's age, but then focusing on his experience. But it just didn't address the fundamental issue, what people had actually seen on that stage.
Meanwhile, Trump is probably loving this, right?
He was in his element. Played the victim, talked about a comeback, repeated those 2020 election fraud claims, even said the indictments were proof the government was out to get him.
Ironically, all that just made him stronger with his base.
Exactly. And he was already dominating the news cycle, so Biden's message was getting drowned out even more.
So what was Trump's play after the debate? Did he go on the attack?
Not right away. He was smarter than that. He basically let the Democrats stew in their own anxieties. It was a let them eat themselves kind of strategy.
Well, he was just sitting back watching the Democratic Party implode.
Pretty much. Mike Johnson even brought up the 25th Amendment, which shows how much doubt was swirling. Of course, people like Clyburn and Jeffries did publicly back Biden, but even their endorsements were a little, tepid.
Like, we support him for now, but let's see what happens.
Exactly. And then you had Kamala Harris having to face those nervous donors.
Yeah, that couldn't have been an easy conversation.
She acknowledged Biden had a rough night, but she quickly pivoted to his accomplishments, trying to reassure them that everything was still on track.
And what about the big names, the Clintons? How did they react to all this?
They both came out in support of Biden. Hillary, she's been through the ringer, so she brushed off the attacks on Biden's age and health as nonsense. Bill, he thought it was best to give Biden space to decide his own future.
Okay, but were all the big donors as patient?
Not everyone. People like Peter Orszag, they saw the debate as disqualifying and stopped fundraising for Biden.
Oh, wow.
And while not everyone on Wall Street agreed, there was definitely a sense of, uh-oh, we might have a problem here. The money was drying up, and not just in New York.
And back in Biden's camp, how are they handling the fallout?
Blaming each other. Hunter Biden reportedly pointed the finger at advisors like Dunn and Ricchetti for pushing the early debate and not prepping Biden properly.
Oh man, internal finger pointing never ends well.
Obama, he wasn't sure if Biden was the best choice anymore, but he didn't see any clear alternatives. He even thought maybe an open primary would be the best way to find a replacement if they needed one.
So the idea of replacing Biden was starting to be floated more openly.
Yeah, and it sounds like potential successors were already making moves. Gretchen Whitmer, for example, reached out to Kamala Harris to assure her she wasn't trying to push Biden out.
But was there trust there?
Whitmer wasn't convinced that all of Harris's advisors believed her. So they had a one-on-one to try and clear the air, avoid the kind of drama that happened during the 2020 VP selection.
Okay, so they were trying to manage the situation, keep things from getting too messy.
Right. And then there was the whole Biden-Obama dynamic, which was, well, a little complicated.
How so?
Biden reportedly felt like Obama had slighted him in the past, judged him politically. He still believed he could have beaten Trump in 2016.
So there was some lingering resentment there.
Yeah. So when Obama reached out after the debate to ask about the path forward, Biden took it as a sign of doubt, even though Obama was probably just trying to be supportive.
Ouch. And then the Supreme Court threw another wrench into the works with that immunity ruling.
Yeah. That really rattled the Democrats. They worried it would embolden Trump if he got a second term. Biden gave a speech about it, but he didn't really reaffirm his own candidacy, which worried his aides.
Like maybe he was already having second thoughts.
Maybe. And then you had Pelosi openly questioning whether Biden's debate performance was a one-time thing or a sign of something more serious.
Oh, wow.
She said it was a legitimate question for both candidates, given their ages. And then Congressman Doggett became the first to call for Biden to drop out, citing the polls and the danger of a Trump victory.
So the pressure was really mounting. How was the Biden campaign handling all of this?
Not well. They went silent after the debate, radio silence at the top. It felt like things were falling apart.
But wasn't the DNC still backing Biden?
They were, because of party rules and all the years Biden spent building loyalty. A challenge at the convention was highly unlikely, but the mood within the party was shifting.
And what about Kamala Harris? What was she doing during all this?
She was working the phones, reaching out to governors, some who were worried about Biden, others who might have seen an opportunity.
Right.
Biden's allies tried to calm things down, pointing to upcoming events like an ABC interview and the NATO conference. Wait and see, they said. Give him a chance to recover.
But were people really willing to wait?
There were definitely doubts. Anita Dunn, she'd been through a contested convention in 1980, so she was pushing for a show of force from Biden's delegates in big states like New York and California.
Trying to prevent a rebellion.
Exactly. But the problem was the Biden campaign hadn't really done much to organize their delegates, so it was hard to gauge how much support he actually had.
Oh, man, that's not good. And then there was that House caucus meeting where everything kind of boiled over, right?
Yeah, that was a turning point. You had representatives like Custer and Pedersen saying Biden should step aside. They were worried about him losing to Trump.
Makes sense. That was the big fear, right?
Absolutely. But then you had Fetterman saying Biden was the only one who could beat Trump. And then other senators, like Tester and Brown, they were worried that Biden would hurt their chances of getting reelected.
So a real mix of opinions, but a lot of anxiety.
Yeah, even Schumer was taken aback by how intense it was. One Biden ally pointed out that every public appearance was a risk at that point. They just didn't understand why the team wasn't seeing it. The window for a mini primary was closing fast.
And then there was that blow up with the donors, right?
Oh, yeah. Some donors started voicing concerns about Biden's electability, and his aides lost it. They accused the donors of being selfish and even threatened to remember who was with them and who wasn't.
Not exactly the best way to handle a delicate situation.
No, not at all. And then you had Pelosi's appearance on Morning Joe, which was, well, a bit of a bombshell.
How so?
It was so out of character for her to appear on that show, especially so early in the morning. And she was very hesitant in her words about Biden.
Like she was choosing her words very carefully.
Exactly. And remember, she'd spoken to both Obama and Biden, and she was talking to donors and lawmakers on both sides. She was in a unique position to understand the situation.
So her refusal to strongly defend Biden was a huge sign.
It was, and the Biden campaign was furious. They felt like she was sabotaging him. One aide even yelled, "Fuck you, Nancy."
Oh man, that's bad.
Biden felt betrayed, especially after Obama had already stepped back. And it wasn't just Pelosi. The AFL-CIO leaders also had serious concerns after meeting with Biden. They weren't sure he could articulate a path to victory.
So it was a complete meltdown.
It was. And all this infighting was hurting Biden's chances. His national polls were dipping, but the swing state numbers were even worse. They couldn't campaign effectively against Trump.
Right, they were too busy fighting amongst themselves.
Exactly. And it became clear that Biden probably couldn't recover. The question became, who's the best person to beat Trump?
So what was Pelosi doing during all this? Was she actively working to replace Biden?
She knew Biden probably wouldn't listen to her advice, but she wanted to make sure he understood how worried her caucus was. She tried to present it as just relaying concerns, but Biden knew she was a powerful figure and her doubts carried weight.
And what about the UAW? Weren't they a strong Biden supporter?
They were, but their board was divided. Some felt like Biden wasn't the best choice for them anymore. Their president, Fain, even told Biden's advisors about these concerns right when they were planning a big rally in Detroit.
Oh, that's risky.
It was. It risked alienating the union and dividing the Democrats even more. And meanwhile, Trump was riding high. The polls were in his favor. The Supreme Court had just given him that broad immunity, and he was about to announce his running mate and accept the nomination.
And then, just when you think things can't get any crazier, there's an assassination attempt on Trump.
Yeah, it was at a rally in Pennsylvania. Shots were fired, one person was injured, and a Secret Service agent was killed protecting Trump.
Oh my God, that's terrible.
It was a horrific event. And of course, the political implications were immediate. Trump's advisors saw it as a way to highlight Biden's age and frailty. The Biden campaign, they went into damage control mode, telling everyone to lay low and avoid saying anything that could be construed as attacking Trump.
So what about the VP selection? Who did Trump end up choosing?
He went with J.D. Vance. Trump Jr. was a big advocate for him, while Rubio had some support but took a more passive approach. Trump seemed to enjoy the whole process, seeing who was jockeying for the position.
And amidst all this chaos, what was Kamala Harris doing?
She was quietly working the phones, talking to lawmakers and donors, trying to shore up support for Biden.
But wasn't she also positioning herself for a potential takeover?
It was a delicate balance. She wanted to be loyal to Biden, but she also knew she needed to be ready if he stepped aside. And this was uncharted territory, a president potentially dropping out after winning the majority of delegates.
Right, there was no precedent for this.
So her outreach was very targeted, focused on trusted allies to avoid leaks or misinterpretations.
And it sounds like her allies were also starting to make moves.
Yeah, by mid-July, they were reaching out to delegates, gauging their support if Biden dropped out. Donna Brazile even called Nikki Fried, the chair of the Florida Democratic Party, to ask about her support for Harris. Fried, she was tired of defending Biden, and she was excited about the prospect of a Harris ticket.
So the wheels were starting to turn.
They were, and the disconnect between the Biden campaign's optimism and the reality on the ground was becoming more and more obvious.
Right, they kept saying everything was fine, but the party was clearly falling apart.
More and more Democrats were calling for Biden to step down. Even Biden himself was starting to have doubts.
Really?
He asked about fundraising, because that usually ramps up after the nomination, but he was told it might have to wait until the convention. So he had a meeting with Donilon and Ricchetti, and they gave him the bad news. The polls were tanking, especially in swing states.
So he was facing the possibility of a humiliating defeat.
He was. And it sounds like that's what ultimately led to his decision. He called Amie Dillon and told her he didn't think he could win and that he didn't want to hurt the party's chances of beating Trump.
So he put the party before his own ambition.
It seems that way. And then the focus shifted to managing the transition and getting Biden to endorse Harris.
Right, they had to make it as smooth as possible.
Exactly. Harris wanted everything to happen quickly to avoid chaos. Clyburn stressed to Biden how important it was to endorse her, to show unity. Obama also talked to Clyburn, probably about different scenarios, but Clyburn insisted on unity behind Harris.
And Pelosi, what was her role in all this?
She kept saying she wasn't orchestrating Biden's exit, but privately she thought it was the right move. She was all about winning no matter who the candidate was. And shortly after she had lunch with Governor Murphy and his wife, the news broke. Biden was dropping out.
And despite the show of unity, there was still some tensions.
Oh, yeah. There was always that underlying friction between the Biden and Harris camps. They'd clashed before, and some in the Harris camp felt like Biden's people had hurt her reputation.
So there were some hurt feelings there.
Definitely. And some Republicans even thought Biden had underestimated Harris.
So it wasn't just about Biden's age and health. It was also about the political dynamics within the party.
Absolutely. It was a perfect storm of factors.
Yeah.
Declining approval ratings, the age issue, the perception that things were going downhill. It all led to Biden deciding to step aside.
And then Harris had to quickly consolidate her position and get ready for the general election.
She immediately started securing endorsements, leveraging her existing support and the fact that, well, she was a Black woman. And the transfer of Biden's campaign funds, that made a big difference, too. It deterred potential rivals.
And how did Trump react to all this?
They were shocked, but not totally surprised. They thought about trying to create chaos among the Democrats, but decided it wasn't worth it.
So they just shifted their focus to Harris.
Exactly. And we also learned about this interesting figure in Trump's inner circle, his son, Barron.
Oh, right. He was pretty low-key during all this.
He was, but he was apparently a valued advisor to his father, even though he stayed behind the scenes.
And what about the Obamas? Weren't they close to Harris?
Harris often talked about their friendship, but it wasn't as close as she made it seem. They weren't really advising her. Obama, along with Pelosi and others, actually preferred an open nomination process, which reportedly hurt Harris's feelings.
So there was some tension there, too.
Yeah, but after Biden endorsed Harris, Obama did reach out to mend fences and offer his support.
Okay, so the Democrats were trying to present a united front, but behind the scenes, it was still pretty messy.
It was. During the transition, there was friction between Biden's old team and Harris's people. Some Biden staffers stayed on, but others were pushed out. O'Malley Dillon's leadership style also caused some tension, even with Harris's close allies.
So a lot of drama, even after Biden dropped out.
Yeah, and Harris was worried about infighting hurting her campaign. They also had to analyze the electoral map and figure out their path to victory.
And what did that look like?
It all came down to Pennsylvania and Georgia. If they could flip those states, they could win. So Harris had to choose a running mate, and she went with Tim Walz, the governor of Minnesota.
Okay, and while all this was happening, what was Trump up to?
Still dealing with drama, even though he was the incumbent. He was still listening to advisors who whispered in his ear, especially Corey Lewandowski, who wasn't even officially on the campaign.
Oh, so the same old Trump, even after all these years.
Pretty much. And despite the midterms not going so well for the Republicans, he decided to run again, even though his approval ratings were low. And he actually moderated his stance on abortion after he won the nomination, which was interesting.
So he was trying to appeal to a broader audience.
It seems that way. And his strategy was to go after Harris, tying her to Biden and highlighting her past positions. They felt confident they could win on policy, but they were worried about her post-Biden polling surge.
So they had to be careful.
They were. They used targeted mailers for more subtle persuasion, and they held a big briefing at Mar-a-Lago to try and get positive media coverage.
So a mix of tactics.
Exactly. They wanted to make sure they didn't squander their advantage.
And one of their main lines of attack was linking Harris to Biden's policies.
Right. They kept saying she was more of the same, that the country was on the wrong track. Harris tried to differentiate herself with some modified policies, like a homebuyer tax credit and an extension of the child tax credit. But then she proposed federal price controls on groceries, which backfired badly.
Oh, yeah, that didn't go over well.
Not at all. It played right into Trump's hands, making her look like a socialist.
And then came the Democratic convention.
It was a big moment for Harris to introduce herself to the country. But there was concern about Biden speaking after prime time when fewer people would be watching.
So they had to make sure Harris had her moment.
They did. Her speech was all about presenting herself as a different kind of leader. Not Biden, not Trump. And of course, Trump was watching and commenting on Truth Social the whole time.
Of course he was. And after the convention, how did the polls look?
Harris was leading in some battleground states, but the polls also showed she was vulnerable on issues like inflation and immigration, which were Trump's strong points.
So it was still a close race.
It was, and they brought in Stephanie Cutter to prep Harris for interviews and debates.
Oh, she's a seasoned pro.
She is, but her style was reportedly pretty dominant, and some worried that Harris wasn't getting enough practice.
So they had to make sure Harris was ready for the spotlight.
Exactly. And then came the debate prep, which was intense. Mike Pence even gave them some advice, saying Harris was good at attacking but needed to work on defending her own record.
Interesting. So they were trying to learn from past mistakes.
They were, and Harris's main line in the debate was, "I am not Joe Biden, and I am certainly not Donald Trump," trying to create some distance while also drawing a contrast.
Smart strategy.
It was. And before the debate, Trump was hammering her on all sorts of things. Transgender surgeries, gun confiscation, fracking. He kept reminding people about his supposed economic successes.
Oh, so he's throwing everything at her.
He was. And after the VP debate, he praised Vance and told Lewandowski to focus on surrogate appearances.
So he was feeling good.
He was. But even though Harris had a lead after the convention, her momentum started to stall.
Oh, that's not good.
It suggested she might have hit a ceiling in her support. They needed to find new ways to reach voters.
So what did they do?
They tried door knocking, but some weren't convinced it was effective. They decided to target the middle 60% of the electorate, not just their base.
Okay, trying to broaden their appeal.
Exactly. But even with all that, Trump's internal polls were still pretty steady. The race was tight, but they weren't panicking.
So they felt confident.
They did. They also noticed a potential shift among young black men who seemed to be moving away from the Democrats.
Oh, that's a crucial demographic.
It is. They targeted them specifically, hoping to chip away at Harris's support. And then there was another assassination attempt on Trump.
Oh my God, another one.
Yeah, but thankfully, Secret Service caught the guy before he could do anything. And the Harris campaign responded in a more low-key way this time.
Probably learned from the first time.
Probably. And then there was the VP debate, where Vance played the nice guy and Walz seemed a bit nervous.
So Vance came out ahead.
It seemed that way. And then Trump went back to that rally site in Pennsylvania where the first attempt happened.
That must have been a charged atmosphere.
It was, but Trump didn't seem to notice or care. He just did his usual rally thing.
So he wasn't letting it get to him.
Not at all. And the Harris campaign was still trying to find ways to reach more voters. They even considered an interview with Joe Rogan.
Wow, that would have been interesting.
It would have. They wanted to reach his huge audience, especially those white male voters who might be open to switching sides.
So they were getting creative.
They were. And their internal polls showed that Trump supporters were much more enthusiastic about voting this time around, while Democratic enthusiasm was flat.
So they had a motivation problem.
They did. And Trump started running those negative ads about Harris, especially that one about the ACLU questionnaire and transgender surgeries.
Oh, yeah, that one was controversial.
It was. Trump was hesitant about using CNN's Aaron Burnett in the ad, but he eventually agreed. And it was effective.
It painted Harris as being out of touch with mainstream values.
Exactly. Bill Clinton even urged the Harris campaign to fight back, but they didn't listen.
Really?
Yeah, he'd seen the data, and he was worried, but O'Malley Dillon dismissed his concerns.
So they stuck to their guns, even though it might have been a mistake.
It might have been. And then there was that other ad that used a clip of Harris on The View, which was very effective for Trump.
It reinforced the idea that she was just an extension of Biden.
Exactly. And in the final weeks, they had that rally in Texas on a Friday night, which was weird timing.
Why did they do that?
Apparently, it was to be closer to Joe Rogan for those interview negotiations.
Oh, so they were still hoping to land that interview.
It seems so. And Trump, he actually started promoting early voting, which was a big change for him.
He'd always been against it before, hadn't he?
He had, but Wiles convinced him it was a good strategy. And as early voting progressed, some people thought Harris's team was downplaying it because the numbers were looking good for Trump.
So they were trying to manage expectations.
It seems that way. And then Trump pulled ahead in the polls.